running water, that's just a ditch. So, one of the sources of my indignation about people getting this wrong is the fact that an enormous amount of effort has gone into the creation of this hedge. And it wasn't created by me, it wasn't created by my father, it was created generations ago at a time when everything was pretty feudal, labour was cheap, and you'll be pretty sure that the labourers who did this work were not paid a lot of money. I'm not sure that you can be sure they were unhappy, but what they did was magnificent. So there's running water there like a torrent. That is the drainage system for these fields. These fields wouldn't be productive grass pastures if they weren't properly drained. These fields wouldn't be productive grass pastures if they weren't properly drained. And there's a woodland up there that's called Channel Stall Coppice, which is a weird name for a woodland. Coppice is a form of wood, but the channel stall part of it explains why the wood was put there. It was put there to be an accumulation of water that's come off of the higher fields through the ditches, so it's stalling the flow of water to make it a steady flow of what comes out of that woodland and continues to pick up from all drains that are underneath this field and fed into that ditch. Those drains were hand dug. They have clay pipes, and that's another whole load of work that most people disregard these days. We're on a clay valley here, and it would be soggy to a large extent, unmanageable, if those drains weren't in place and if this ditch wasn't in place. And you put the ditch along the side of the hedge because it's a sensible place at the edge of the field to collect above ground water that's been picked up by these underground drains. And of course it flows downhill, so you have hedges that find a gradient to follow so that the ditch at the side of the hedge will pick up the water and manage it down to the stream that joins the river. So old drainage systems, old barriers between fields called hedges, and because there's a lot of stones taken out, there's a big bank in the middle, which is where all the stones were thrown in. And the hedge that was constructed is constructed with a hedge this side of the bank and a hedge that side of the bank. So it's extremely wide. In a minute we're going to measure it. I laid that hedge probably 5 or 6 years ago. Because it was in a stewardship, we were funded to put some fencing up to protect it. So there's a wire fence here that stops the animals damaging the hedge at that vulnerable stage when you've just laid it. And then John White, who does my hedge cutting, comes along every year and cuts to the same place. Because the fence is there, he can't cut it up against the hedge itself. He cuts up to the wire fence, which means the hedge over the years has become wider than it was designed to be, and it's not high as it normally might be, but that's a height which is manageable for John to keep on top of it. Because it's cut to the same level every year there's new growth from quite low down, which makes it a very thick hedge. This is the thickest hedge you're going to find anywhere. And now we need to measure it. Where's the tape measure?
There it is.
Okay. I measure to where that tree is there. That's as far as John can reach, and later on we can touch the other side. That's not even halfway. So that's 3 meters 10. I would say we've got probably 7 meters at its width. We're going to go up and measure it again. If I can disengage myself properly.
Can you measure to a point and then go to the other side and measure to that point again?
Yeah, I think we're
together. There you go, it works.
So that's just 3 meters. We're going to end up saying it's at least 6 meters next time we get there. We know from some study that was done that in terms of how much carbon is tied up in this hedge, there's as much underground as there is above ground. My theory, and it is only theory,
Yeah.
is that if you're talking about the carbon that is captured by this hedge, then the fundamental important detail is how high is it, how wide is it at the point where it's cut back to, and recognising it's cut back to that point every year, what happens to it? Well, the flail comes along and smashes it up into small pieces, and a bit like the leaves that come off that tree, it falls as litter to the bottom of the hedge. And that is not going back into the atmosphere. So, put simply, I think it's fair to say that the majority of the impact of this hedge is equal to the growth that is cut off every year. I can't accept that if you cut that off every third year instead of every year, that you're reducing the amount of carbon capture that it makes. I think it's going to be actually more effective cutting it off every year.
What's John's theory?
He would be very resistant to the idea of cutting it less frequently, because he knows that if he cuts it to this level every year, then he's only cutting small material, which means that it's not going to have a big impact on the hedge. If he cuts stuff that's a few years old, like the small branches that are alongside that tree, if he tries to cut that with a flail, it will just make a hell of a mess and damage the plant right down to the roots, because you're hitting on solid trunk. So that's why he doesn't like the idea of doing it less frequently than once a year.